They stripped me, they put me in handcuffs, they put me inside a car, and I didn't know where they were taking me. Then I spent a day in interrogations, and in their interrogation they told me if I were to write another column for the Washington Post, because it annoyed them a lot that I wrote for the Washington Post, I would go to prison. After thinking a lot, I took the decision that the only way to protect myself was to precisely tell this, and wrote another column, saying that if I went to prison, it was because they told me that writing another column would end me up in prison.
Hi and welcome to a special edition of Times Radio Magnitsky Interviews, where we talk to those being awarded in Sir William Browder's 2025 Magnitsky Awards. I'm Laura Martinez-Williams, and today we'll be talking to Abraham Jiménez Enoa, who is a Cuban journalist currently exiled in Spain and receiving the award for Outstanding Journalist. He's being recognised for his fearless reporting under Cuba's authoritarian regime. He is the co-founder of the magazine El Estornudo, Cuba's first independent online magazine, and has also written the book La Isla Oculta Historias de Cuba, The Hidden Island Stories of Cuba. He's documenting Cuba's hidden injustices, the regime's brutality, and the daily resilience of ordinary Cubans living under totalitarianism. Abraham, welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you.
Let's start at the beginning, Abraham, with your grandfather, a man famously who was the bodyguard of Cuba's authoritarian leader, Fidel Castro. How does one go from being so close to the ruling Communist Party and then you deciding to write pieces exposing it?
With journalism, of course, because with journalism, it's the cause of everything. I was born into a family that was attached to the Cuban Revolution. The heroes of my childhood were Che, Fidel, and all the leaders of the revolution, because it was what I heard at home, what I could see. And it wasn't until I went to university, that a lot later, that I started to see as a journalist what was really happening in my country, that I started to take into consideration what I was seeing, and it was a reality absolutely disrupted. A lot of what I had been told was not like that, and that I had been living for a long time in deceit.
Que me empecé a dar cuenta de que había una realidad absolutamente trastocada, ¿no? Y que todo, mucha parte de todo lo que me habían contado no era tan así y que había vivido durante mucho tiempo en una falacia.
Let's go back a bit. You graduated from a degree in journalism from the University of Havana in 2012, and then you went to work as an archivist for the Ministry of Information until 2016. What brought you to found El Estornudo magazine and El Estornudo magazine, and were there any consequences to that?
I and my generation of journalists that graduated from university, I was in university from 2012, and it wasn't until the end of 2015 that Cubans could connect to the internet for the first time ever. And this was revolutionary. A lot of people were excited to be able to connect through the country, a country that, in Cuba, there is only one party, the Communist Party, and in turn, the Communist Party is in charge of all law, all media, all the magazines, all the newspapers, the radio stations, all the television channels are subordinated to the Communist Party. So doing journalism outside of that place is violating the law. So when the internet became a legal space, it was opened up and was not yet legislated. And then we took the opportunity to tell the country what it had not been told before, to make the redundancy. And that meant the dream lasted very little because, well, at first we didn't think we were going to change the country, that we were doing a great thing. In fact, we were doing something very important, but in a short time, the government, not only El Estornudo, which was the magazine that I founded with a group of friends, but all the independent media that came up began to persecute them, harass them. And well, the end of that story is that the vast majority of us are in exile today. El Estornudo was born in 2016, and well, I was one of the last to be exiled, and it was in 2022. Let's say that dream lasted about 6 years, which was very little, because during all that time, we were telling the country we had to endure express kidnappings, arbitrary interrogations, home imprisonment. My family and friends were interrogated. My family and friends were harassed. They were discredited on social networks, in the media. That was very hard all the time. And well, it was the price we had to pay. I tell you, not only me, but all my generation, all those who tried to tell the country, we had to go through all that.
Ese sueño que fue muy poco, porque durante todo ese tiempo, mientras contábamos el país, tuvimos que soportar secuestros express, interrogatorios arbitrarios, prisiones domiciliarias, interrogatorios a familia, amigos, acoso a familia, amigos, intervención de la comunicación pública, descrédito en redes sociales, en medios de comunicación. Entonces fue muy duro todo ese tiempo, y bueno, fue el precio que tuvimos que, ya te digo, no solo yo, sino toda mi generación, o los que lo intentamos, contar el país, ¿no? Tuvimos que pasar por todo eso.
Is it true that your first ever office was in the street and basically cost most of your salary to be able to support yourself?
Mi primera y mi única.
Yes, my first and my only. When they installed the internet
Exacto.
in Cuba, what happened was they put 30 Wi-Fi antennas in public parks. People would go with their mobiles and laptops in the street. Surreal images, because everyone was stuck to the antennas, because the antenna distributes the connection. It was not very powerful. My office was on the floor, and I found a leafy tree where lots of ants and I would sit there when the sun rose, and set when I needed to go home. And I would work in the middle of the street, and I was there until 2019. They put the internet on phones. I could work at home because I connected the phone to the laptop, and well, I could, but everything was extremely expensive. When the internet started in Cuba, an hour of internet in exchange was equivalent to $2. And when I left, I don't know if the prices will be the same, but I remember that the cheapest mobile phone was 400 megabytes, which is nothing. It's 3 videos and 4 readings. It cost the equivalent of $5. So people in many cases, people had to choose between connecting to the internet and accessing social networks and reading the press or dressing up and eating, because it was extremely expensive. It is extremely expensive.
Cuando empezó internet en Cuba, 1 hora de internet al cambio era el equivalente a $2, 1 hora de internet. Y cuando yo me fui, no sé si seguirán los precios así, pero el paquete de telefonía móvil más barato, que era de 400 megabytes, que eso es nada, son 3 videos y 4 lecturas, costaba como el equivalente a $5. Entonces, la gente, en muchos casos, la gente tenía que escoger entre conectarse a internet y acceder a las redes sociales y leer la prensa, o vestirse y comer, porque era extremadamente caro. Es extremadamente caro.
So I can imagine it'd be quite easy to control, for the government to control it.
Claro, y además...
Exactly, and the government blocked all independent media. It was not only monetary censorship, which was obviously a reason why people couldn't connect, but also the fact that independent media was blocked. They cannot connect to the internet in the national territory. Furthermore, as years went by, they have passed legislation and laws that legislate the virtual space. And, for example, if you make a criticism or comment against the government, you could be fined in economic capital or go to prison. If you give a like to a comment that criticizes the government, it could cost you a fine, or you could go to prison. It's an absolutely surreal scenario.
Capital económico o ir hasta preso. Dar un like te puede costar, a un comentario en contra del gobierno te puede costar dinero, o puedes ir preso. Entonces es un escenario absolutamente surreal y dictatorial.
You describe experiencing repeated intimidation, violent interrogations, arbitrary restrictions on movement, internet blackouts, and periods of house arrest. Do you mind telling us when was the first time you started to realise that the government didn't agree with your reporting?
Well, I think it was the first time that it occurred to me that they arrested me, right? I had been writing for about a year. Well, they imprisoned me at home. They took me to a police station. They kept me there all day. They took my cell phone, my laptop, and well, in that long conversation, well, I call it that diplomatically because it wasn't a conversation, it was an interrogation, where they threatened me and such. I realized that they knew everything I was doing, right? They knew where I was walking, who I was relating to. Obviously, they listened to all my conversations and they followed me on the street, right? Things that I didn't even remember. Like, they would tell me, no, 3 months ago you had dinner with this person, and I didn't even remember that. And they had the time where, I don't know, they had detailed knowledge of all my life. And there I realized, well, it wasn't a game, right? That at that moment, the game of the journalist had just ended without anything happening, right? And from there, I had more awareness of what I was doing and my role within the country. And, well, I tried in that way. I, personally, as a person, I changed because I had to start taking a series of measures with respect to my environment. to my friends, to my family, to what I was doing, my communications, and also, well, they also began to suffer in retaliation and consequence to everything that surrounded me. Because it's not only as macabre as the system works, that it not only affects you, for example, my parents were also interrogated, they were also threatened, also my friends, for example. I lost many friends because they didn't want to get close to me, because getting close to me meant, for example, that they took their salary, as everyone belongs to the government. They took their salary for a month. It meant that they were also interrogated, that their phones were checked. And then, well, you start to be alone in a whole country.
También empezaron a sufrir represalias y consecuencias todo lo que me rodeaba, ¿no? Porque no solo es tan macabro como funciona el sistema que no solo te afecta a ti. Por ejemplo, a mis padres también los interrogaban, también los amenazaban, también a mis amigos. Por ejemplo, yo perdí muchos amigos porque, bueno, no se querían acercar a mí, porque acercarse a mí significaba, por ejemplo, que le quitaban el salario, como todos del gobierno, que le quitaran el salario de un mes. Significaba que también los interrogaran, que les revisaran sus teléfonos. Entonces, bueno, te empiezas a quedar solo en todo un país.
On October 20th, 2020, you wrote a column for the Washington Post entitled "Si esta fuera mi última columna aquí, es porque estoy preso en Cuba. If this is my last column here, it's because I've been in prison in Cuba." Here you detailed being strip searched by 3 state security agents, and you write, "Miraba mis zapatos y pensaba en cómo es posible que un gobierno le tenga tanto miedo a que su propia realidad salga a la luz, que es capaz de atropellar a algún con semejante impunidad por tan solo contar esa realidad." I can't imagine how you were feeling at this time. Do you mind telling us what led you to the point to write it?
It was probably the most scary thing in my life, because it became physical. They stripped me, they put me in handcuffs, they put me inside a car, and I didn't know where they were taking me. Then I spent a day in interrogations, and in their interrogation they told me if I were to write another column for the Washington Post, because it annoyed them a lot that I wrote for the Washington Post, I would go to prison. After thinking a lot, I took the decision that the only way to protect myself was to precisely tell this, and wrote another column, saying that if I went to prison, it was because they told me that writing another column would end me up in prison. The only way to protect myself is with my own words, and my own writing, my own journalism, and further from this, people deserve to know how this country operates, how they try to silence people. I was writing to protect myself, and also to be part of the story of the country, and well, I couldn't help it. For a long time, when I analyse how now, with the distance and time, there is a very drastic change in my writing, because I started writing chronicles and reports of 15 to 20 pages, where I interview people, most of the time in third person, and such. Towards the end, most of my articles are in first person, like this one you've mentioned. And they're in first person because at the end, basically, I had to continue writing and to continue telling it to the country, and I had to tell it myself, because I couldn't even go out on the street, I couldn't even have a source, people didn't talk to me anymore, so I had to tell myself to be able to tell the country, and to be able to express myself. For example, there were days when I couldn't even throw away the rubbish in my house. There were policemen dressed as civilians, disguised, outside my house, and they told me, if you step outside the house, you're going to prison. So, of course, I was locked up in my own house. What was I going to do? I had to tell what it was to be locked up in your own house, right? How is the day-to-day of a person who can't throw away the rubbish in their house? And so, time went by, and when I review most of my last articles in Cuba, they're all in first person, because, well, the only thing I had left was to tell the story myself.
Ya ni siquiera podía tener fuente, ya la gente no me hablaba, y entonces yo tuve que contarme a mí mismo para poder contar al país, ¿no? Y para poder también expresar, no sé, por ejemplo, había días que ni siquiera yo podía botar la basura de mi casa, que iba a salir y habían policías vestidos de civil disfrazados fuera de mi casa, y me decían, si pones un pie fuera de la casa, vas preso. Entonces, claro, yo encerrado en mi propia casa, ¿qué iba a hacer? Entonces yo tenía que contar que era, bueno, quedarse encerrado en una propia casa, ¿no? Cómo es el día a día de una persona que no puede botar la basura de su casa. Y así fue pasando el tiempo bueno, y cuando yo reviso la mayoría de mis últimos artículos en Cuba, todos son en primera persona porque, bueno, lo único que me quedaba era contarme a mí mismo.
And was this the turning point that made you decide that Cuba wasn't safe anymore, and that's why you're in exile in Spain now?
No, ni siquiera yo lo decidí, porque
No, I
otra
didn't
de las
even decide it,
represalias era
because another of the
que no me
repercussions
dejaban
was that
tener
they didn't let
pasaporte.
me
Yo
have
no
a
tenía
passport.
pasaporte.
I didn't have a
Sí, en
passport.
Cuba hay
In Cuba, there
le
are
llaman
what they call
regulados
migratory regulations,
migratorios, que es
which are a kind
casi
of
una
list
especie
where there are
de lista
activists, artists, people who don't
donde
let leave
están
the country.
artistas, activistas,
So I was there,
gente que
I
no
didn't have a
dejan salir del
passport,
país.
and
Entonces
always
yo
in these
estaba allí, no
interrogations,
tenía
when they
pasaporte
threatened me, when I was in
siempre en
contact with
estos
them, or they sent me
interrogatorios, cuando
messages
me
with other people, they
amenazaban,
told
cuando
me, if you keep writing,
tenía
you'll never leave
contactos
the
con ellos o
country.
me mandaban
So
recados
I was
con
like a
personas,
kind
me
of
decían, si
political
sigues
prison
escribiendo,
inside the
nunca te vas a
country.
ir del país. Entonces
But
yo
in
estaba como una especie
2021,
de prisión
that
política
was a
dentro
government
del
strategy.
país.
It wasn't
Entonces,
just with me,
pero
it
en
was with
el
artists,
año
activists, and
2021,
such. But the internet, and since everyone
eso
was
era una
there, it exploded.
estrategia
And there were some very
gubernamental,
big
¿no? No era solo
protests in
conmigo,
Cuba in
eran con artistas,
2021,
activistas y
which
tal.
ended with more than
Pero
1,000 political prisoners,
internet
people who went out on
y
the
como todo
streets
el mundo
just to
estaba allá
express
adentro,
themselves.
explotó
So as a
y
result
hubo
of
unas
those
protestas muy
protests, the
grandes
first
en Cuba
ones
en
in a
el año
decade,
2021 que
the government
terminó con
changed the
más
strategy.
de 1000
And then
presos
what they
políticos,
wanted
gente
was
que
to
salió a
throw
la calle
everyone
sola,
out of the
cosas así.
country. So it wasn't
Entonces,
just
a
me.
raíz de
In fact, I was one of the last of my generation, those who were not in prison. They told them, well, if you don't go to prison,
gobierno
you have to
cambió la
leave the country.
estrategia y
And people
entonces
left.
lo que
So they
lo que
contacted
hizo
me,
fue
they called me
echar
on
a
the
todo el
phone.
mundo del
My
país.
second book
Entonces
ends with
no
that
fue solo
call.
a mí,
They call
sino
me on the
de
phone
hecho
and
fui
tell me
uno de
that
los
they are going
últimos
to
en
give
recibir
me
la
my
acción.
passport, but there is
Empezaron
a
los que no
condition
estaban presos,
that I have
pues
to
le
leave the
decían, bueno,
country.
si
It
no
wasn't
vas
that
a
I
la
decided
prisión,
it. They
tienes
told
que irte del
me,
país.
either
Y
you
la
leave the
gente se iba.
country or
Entonces
you goes to
ellos me
prison. And
contactaron,
I
me
obviously
llamaron
chose to
por
leave.
teléfono. Mi segundo libro termina con esa llamada. Me llaman por teléfono y me dicen que ellos me van a entregar mi pasaporte, pero hay una condición, que me tengo que ir del país. Si no, no fue que yo lo decidí, ellos me dijeron, o te vas del país o vas a prisión, y evidentemente yo escogí irme del país. Sí.
Can we speak about what's happened after you moving to Spain? You told BBC World that salir de Cuba es un golpe de realidad con el mundo, porque ahí es como vivir en otra galaxia. That leaving Cuba is a harsh dose of reality because it's like living in another galaxy. What did you mean by this?
Bueno,
Well, let's say that most of planet Earth, the world, is
digamos que la
governed by
mayoría
neoliberalism and capitalism.
del
Some
planeta
in a better
Tierra,
way,
del
others
mundo,
in a worse way.
está
And there are a
regido,
series of
¿no?,
other
por
countries,
el
very few, some by
neoliberalismo y el
religion, like
capitalismo,
Iran,
¿no?
others by
Todos
politics, like North
de
Korea,
mejor manera,
and
otros
well,
de
there
peor
is also
manera. Y
Cuba,
hay una
and
serie
such,
de
which work
otros
in a
países,
different way from the
como
rest of the world.
unos por religión,
So,
con
leaving
miras,
these
otros
countries
por
means
política,
arriving in an
allá al
unknown
norte.
place, another galaxy.
Y bueno, ¿y por
If
qué
someone
también está
leaves the
Cuba y
United
tal?
States, for example, to
funciona de una
England,
manera
it won't
distinta
surprise
todo el
them.
orden
If someone leaves
mundial,
England to
¿no?
Brazil, it can surprise you, the
Entonces,
nature, it can surprise you, the
bueno,
poverty,
salir
a
de
few
estos
more things, a few
países
less things.
significa,
But let's say the system that
bueno,
governs those is
llegar a un
identical.
lugar
So
desconocido, valga la
suddenly,
redundancia.
at
No, si
33,
alguien se va
I felt like I was born again.
de
I
Estados
had never
Unidos
taken the subway. I had never entered
por
a
ejemplo,
market. I don't know how capitalism works.
Inglaterra,
So
no
things
le
that
va a
most
sorprender.
people
Si
in the
alguien se
world
va de
assume as
Inglaterra a
normal, for
Brasil,
us Cubans,
te
are
puede
different.
sorprender la
So at this
naturaleza, te puede
age, so
sorprender la
old,
pobreza,
we
unas
have to
cosas
learn
más,
to
unas cosas
live
menos, pero
again.
digamos,
The
el
feeling of
sistema
such
que rige
simple
en esos
things, like
países
using Google
es
Maps, which everyone
idéntico, ¿no?
assumes
Claro,
or
entonces de
most
pronto
Cubans who have
yo
never
por
been out
33
don't
años
know how to
sentí que
use
había
that.
nacido de nuevo, ¿no?
And
Nunca me
a
había
lot of
montado en un
other
metro,
things that are
nunca había entrado
difficult.
a un
So given
mercado,
that,
no
I
sé
wrote
cómo
a
funciona el
second book,
capitalismo.
which is called Landing in
Son
the
cosas
World,
que la
where
mayoría de
basically
la gente
what
del
I
mundo
say is,
asume
well,
como
how
normales,
and why
para
I left
nosotros los
Cuba,
cubanos
but
es
also its
distinto, ¿no?
impact
Entonces,
and
a
its
esta edad
connection to capitalism and
también hay que
exile.
aprender
What is exile?
a
And
vivir, ¿no? La
basically, I
sensación
tell scenes like, for
de cosas
example,
tan
that may
sencillas
sound like
como
comedy,
usar
but
Google
suddenly I
Maps,
find
que todo el
myself,
mundo lo tiene como asumido.
consternated because I
Yo y
don't
la
know what
mayoría de
kind
los
of
cubanos que
orange
nunca
juice
han
to
salido
buy
no
because
saben
there are
cómo usar
19
eso.
kinds of orange juice. And that's a problem for me
Y
because
por
I've
ahí
never been
otro
in front
montón
of
de
so
cosas,
many
¿no?
different orange juices.
Que cuesta,
I
¿no?
don't know, but
Y
also
entonces
there
yo,
has another
dado
problem,
eso,
which is
escribí un segundo
racism,
libro que se llama
capitalism, and
Aterrizar
it's
en el
very
mundo,
complex because for
donde
better or for
básicamente lo que
worse,
cuento
being
es,
there in
bueno,
Cuba has you in a
cómo y el por
bubble.
qué salí
And
de
so
Cuba,
basically
pero
what I mean
también
by
ese
that phrase
impacto y
is
esa
that you're
llegada
leaving Cuba
al
and
capitalismo
falling
y al
into the
exilio,
world,
¿no? ¿Qué cosa
that
es el
being in
exilio?
Cuba, you're living on
Y
another planet.
básicamente cuento escenas como, por ejemplo, que pueden sonar a comedia, como de pronto yo me descubro consternado porque no sé comprar qué tipo de jugo de naranja, porque hay 19 tipos de jugo de naranja, Y eso para mí es un problema porque yo nunca he estado ante tanto jugo de naranja, ¿no? No sé, pero también tiene otro problema que es, digamos, el racismo, el capitalismo, y es muy complejo, ¿no? Porque para bien y para mal, estar ahí en Cuba te tiene en una burbuja, ¿no? Y entonces Básicamente, lo que quiero decir con esa frase es eso, ¿no? Que salir de Cuba es caer en el mundo, ¿no? Que estando en Cuba estás viviendo en otro planeta.
I think that really nicely brings us on to your book, La Isla Oculta Historias de Cuba, The Hidden Island Stories of Cuba, which is a series of essays revolving around Cubans who have little resources to survive. In this, you juxtapose ordinary Cubans with the authoritarian regime, exposing the brutalities for ordinary citizens and actions of the secret police. What made you decide to write about this and publish it in a book?
Bueno, un
Well, it's a bit the same,
poco
isn't it? I have the
lo
feeling that
mismo,
even
¿no? Yo
today,
tengo la
even though I
sensación de
think
que
that what Cuba
eh,
is already very noticeable, there's an
todavía
absolute
hoy
lack of knowledge of that
incluso, que
reality.
me parece que
There's still a
ya
lot of
es muy
romanticism that
notable
develops
lo que
Cuba,
es Cuba,
all the
hay
gestures
un
that I
desconocimiento
understand, all the
absoluto de esa
romanticism and
realidad.
seduction that
Todavía
it
hay como
was.
mucho
In
romanticismo
1959, some gentlemen with beards,
que
hippies who
engloba
came down from
a
the
Cuba,
trees in
¿no?
the
Por todas las
mountains,
gestas
suddenly
que yo
overthrew a man who
entiendo,
was
¿no?
starving a
Todo lo
country, and then
romántico
also proposed to make it a
y lo
socialist
seductor
country
que fue,
in the
¿no?
middle of the
En
Caribbean,
el año
almost in the
59,
United
unos
States
señores
backyard.
con
All
barba,
that is very
hippies que
beautiful, and
bajaron
all that
de los
generated many
árboles
good things for
y de la
Cuba.
sierra y
But
de pronto
unfortunately, all that turned in the way,
derrocaron a un
and it ended
hombre
up
que
being
tenía
precisely because those same people who made those
matando
big
de hambre
gestures ended up
a un
wanting to
país
perpetuate themselves in power,
y
and ended
luego
up being a
propone
great
además hacer un país
dictatorship.
socialista en medio
So,
del
on the
Caribe,
one hand,
casi
there is a lot of
en el
ignorance
patio de
of the
Estados Unidos.
reality, and on the other
Todo
hand,
eso
there
es
is
muy bonito
also
y todo eso
the whole
generó
cliche of Cuba, the Caribbean island,
muchas cosas
salsa,
buenas
rum, tobacco.
pero
So
lamentablemente
I
todo eso
tried
se
to make a
torció en
book
el
where I
camino,
would
¿no?
tell the
Y terminó
country
siendo
through secondary
justamente
characters,
porque esas mismas
like the
personas
country that
hicieron esa
people
gesta
don't
tan
know,
grande,
the
terminaron
underground country, and from there
queriendo
that people would look
perpetuarse
and
en el
recognize
poder
that
y
dystopian
terminaron
reality.
siendo
So I went to the
una gran
country, I
dictadura.
chose
Entonces
characters
hay,
that I think
por un
tell
lado,
that
hay mucho
reality so well.
desconocimiento
And I
esa
think through
realidad y
that
por otro
book you
lado,
can see the distance between what people
también
think
está
and what the
como
country
todo el
really is.
cliché de Cuba, la isla, el Caribe, las mulatas, la salsa, el ron, el tabaco. Y entonces yo intenté hacer un libro donde yo contara a través de personajes secundarios el país, como el país que la gente no conoce, el país subterráneo, y a partir de ahí bueno, que la gente pudiera mirar y reconocer esa realidad distópica, ¿no? Y entonces bueno, me fui al interior del país, escogí personajes que creo que cuentan muy bien esa realidad tan diversa y bueno, creo que a través de ese libro se puede ver, ¿no? La distancia que hay entre lo que la gente piensa y lo que es en realidad el país.
There, you said you picked a wide range of characters. Your protagonists range from a female boxer in a country that has long banned the sport for women, a boy who collects money for the underground lottery, and a gigolo, to name some of the few. Why did you pick these to be your main characters?
Yo creo que en
I
ese
think in that
caso
case it was very
fue como
intentional because,
muy
well,
intencional
there is always a lot of
porque,
talk about Cuba. There are many
bueno, sobre
mythical
Cuba siempre
themes.
se
For
habla
example, the case of
con muchos
sports. Cuba
temas,
has many good
digamos,
athletes, and about
míticos,
sports
¿no?
there
Por
are also
ejemplo, el caso
boxers.
del deporte, ¿no?
So I
Cuba
wanted to
con
tell the
muchos
story of
buenos
this girl
deportistas
who is
y
a
tal, y
boxer,
sobre el
and in a
deporte también
country that
boxeadores.
pretends to be free
Entonces,
thinking,
yo quise
female
contar la
boxing is not
historia de esa chica
authorized.
que es
And how
boxeadora
this
de un
girl
país que
lost
se
her whole
va
career
de
without being able
ser
to box.
libre
And through her,
pensador,
it's
no
not
estar
just what those
autorizado
people
el boxeo
represent, but the
femenino
country
y
through
cómo
those
esta chica,
people.
bueno, perdió toda su
Then,
carrera
what was that
sin
person
poder
and what
boxear,
happened,
¿no? Y a
and also
través
the
de
case of the
ella,
gigolo.
no es
How
solo
Cuba
lo que
is, in
esas
many
personas
cases,
representan, sino el
associated with
país
sexual
a través de
tourism,
esas
and
personas,
how
¿no?
in some
Luego, ¿qué
way
fue de
the
esa
government
persona
doesn't
y
accept
qué es lo
it.
que hay? Y en el
And the
caso
same thing
también
happens with the game, well, with the banned games. A
del
country that has
gigoló,
tried in every
como,
way to
bueno,
make a kind
Cuba
of bubble where everything that happens is spectacular,
eh,
while people look
está
for very
en muchos
surreal
casos
ways to make a
asociada
living
al
and to
turismo
entertain
sexual y
themselves.
como de alguna
And that's the
manera
case with the
el
banned
gobierno
games. The intention was
lo
always to
acepta.
show the
Y
other
lo
side of
mismo
the
pasa
country.
con el juego, bueno, con los juegos prohibidos, ¿no? Un país que ha intentado por todas las maneras de hacer una especie de burbuja donde todo lo que suceda es espectacular. Bueno, la gente busca unas maneras muy surreales para ganarse la vida y para entretenerse, ¿no? Y ese es el caso de los juegos prohibidos. Sí, siempre la intención era como mostrar la otra cara del país, ¿no?
Going back to what we talked about earlier in the interview, you moved to Barcelona in 2022. Would you ever want to go back to Cuba? And if so, what would have to happen for you to go back home?
Bueno, no fue una decisión mía.
It wasn't my decision. I think I would never have gone, definitely. I would never have gone out to see the world, but I didn't make the decision. The decision was made for me. And of course, despite all that, Cuba is my country. Cuba is the place where my family lives. I feel Cuban, and it's very hard and very strange at the same time that they strip you of who you are. But no one can steal that from you, because I'm going to continue being Cuban all my life. But, well, I would really like to return to my country, especially to return with my son, who was a year and a half old, and he left Cuba at that age. And, well, it is his country. He was born there. And it's a reality that is very far away from him right now.
Y bueno, es un país, nació allí y es una realidad que ahora mismo le queda como muy lejos. Sí.
Abraham Jiménez Enoa, thank you so much for talking to us at Times Radio.
Thank you.